Hello and welcome to this pre-recorded episode of the Wisdom Factory in the category Conversations That Matter. And this conversation matters very much because it's about the psychology underlying politics. And today I have as a guest Nick Duffell, and he will present himself and also tell us why this is such an interesting topic.
Okay, thank you, Heidi. So, yeah, it's a question. Why bother with psychotherapists in this subject when normally everybody knows psychotherapy is something you go to in your free time. You have an hour, it's private, it's confidential, and you talk about your inner life or your relationships or your conflicts or your dreams. Yeah. And there's been this idea that there's a kind of an interior individual dimension which is completely and totally separate to the sort of outer world, the social world that we live in, which is, of course, it's complete nonsense because we are social beings. We live in what Jung called the collective unconscious. We are continually informing the collective, and the collective is informing us. And it's not difficult to see, especially over the last few years, how the sort of the politics and economics we've been experiencing, especially after the good times started to crash and in 2007, 2008, have hugely infected individuals in their lives. And at the same time, there's been a sort of a revolution in academia where disciplines have started to work together for the first time since the Enlightenment. And in my own field is one of the places that's happened the fastest, where psychotherapy and trauma studies are hugely affected by and linked up with neuroscience. So that we've happily been seeing in my profession how the things that we intuited or theorized about actually become measurable in the human brain. So we got this big movement of disciplines coming together. And then there's a kind of common sense, you know. I mean, if you think about it for a minute, everybody knows politics, economics, it's nothing but emotions, and it's nothing but identity issues. And that's the territory of psychology. So I think it's about time psychology of politics and economics got to look in. So here I am now working pro bono on this subject.
Yeah, you say, I wanted to jump in immediately. You say everybody knows that politics and economy is nothing but emotions. You know that, maybe I know that and somebody else, but most people think that's all rational, that's all, you know, principles and rules and so on.
Yeah.
And mainly, I think that's why it's so disastrous what is happening in the world, because we are not recognizing that instead of our rational mind, who is doing research and evaluation and everything in depth, the final decisions are made emotionally, and we don't want to acknowledge that.
Yeah,
we don't want to acknowledge psychology to be part.
No, and yet we all know perfectly well that the sort of the mainstream media, particularly what we call the red top papers in England, are busy manipulating our emotions, and all successful politicians are busy manipulating emotions of their team, their colleagues, and their voters. Actually, we all know it. We all know it's all about hope. It's all about fear. It's all about I mean, in the end, you know, it's all about values as well. That's where politics starts. And values, you can't get to values without emotions. And the other thing is that, of course, it's all about identity and about belonging. And what we've seen since 2008 is a real return to the politics of identity and belonging. And that's come about because of the world situation, has dramatically changed. So I in the last few years, I started to call myself a psychohistorian. So I say you can't really understand politics without the study of emotions and identity, or without the study of politics and just a study of history, and just a one-liner about the period from the last 100 years. We had the Great War, which was the most disastrous implosion of what I would call modernism, as these very wealthy European colonial nations clashed and fought out their grandiosity to the enormous sacrifice of millions and millions of lives. And then you had a period of total chaos in which some very brave people were trying to go for a new world order with the sort of League of Nations, something that really failed. And then you had the battle fought out all over again in 1939, 45. And then, but since that period, so you've had that period of tremendous chaos and violence. And since the end of the war, since 1948, say, you had a period of tremendous growth, welfare state, the beginnings of much more equality, and all that started to collapse again in 2008 when we had to bail out the bankers. And we now in a position where we haven't had this growth, and we've got this rapid globalization, and actually it's a very, very chaotic position at the moment. So there's a lot of fear around, tremendous amount of fear. And what happens when there's fear around is people regress. And what you see is a return to things like populism, which means having a scapegoat, blaming the immigrants, and then the right-wing politicians, the far right, really, really start to manipulate people out of that position. So if we have a knowledge of history, we can see why this is happening. And if we have a knowledge of something about emotions and identity, we can see how the scapegoating phenomenon always comes in at periods of great stress. And we need to get wise to that, so that political commentators really name that straight away without giving so much airtime to people like Nigel Farage in the British context.
Yeah,
So
I don't know this person.
that's
yeah, that's just a general thing, not to blame others for when you feel overwhelmed and cannot handle your own emotions. Then must be somebody else must be to be blamed.
Yeah.
Must be guilty.
Yeah, it's very satisfying. Terribly satisfying. We love it.
Yeah.
I mean, we all do it at a different level.
Yeah.
I don't find something in the fridge, immediately it's my wife's fault.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like
if something
second nature.
If something doesn't work, you think, who could have done that, instead of thinking, oh, maybe it was me. But at least we sort of get it after a while. But I think it makes a lot of sense to begin with personal psychology and to find out these tendencies which we have, for then to understand how bigger groups of people act. And for me, it's on the other hand also the way out of the problems, because as long as one group blames the other one for that they are not doing as we expect, we don't go anywhere. But when we begin to see the group is formed of single people, and me and you, and we begin to take responsibility for our emotions, then we can go somewhere. But I see the responsibility is not really very much en vogue at the moment. It's better to blame somebody else, for what I'm suffering.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's two reasons for that I see, and one is just to go back to what we said earlier. It's a time of great stress. And in time of great stress, all of us regress, and then having someone to blame makes us feel better. It just makes us feel better, because because then you're not in complete nowhere land, you know. It's because these immigrants are coming that my life is so bad, for example. It just squares the circle. But the other thing to say is, when you start to talk about responsibility, of course you are right. And Heidi, it's like our generation, we've had the benefit of another revolution that's gone on, which is the revolution in personal awareness and self-development and mysticism and psychotherapies and yoga and stuff like this. And there's quite a large group which has grown up with that. And, you know, we have this benefit, and we see how becoming responsible for things is not only just kind of a moral way, it's an effective way. It's a more effective way of being able to respond rather than react. So that's part of the self-development movement. And you've got this phenomenon that you've got sectors of the population who actually are at different level of consciousness, you know, and this is partly to do with class, partly to do with education, but it's also just it's just the way things are. So that you can't force responsibility on someone who's in tremendous stress and is seeing, you know, something going on which is threatening to their identity. You can't say to that person, it's time for you now to take responsibility. You can't, because firstly, they're not there in terms of consciousness. And secondly, this is what we know from psychotherapy, daily psychotherapy insight, is that if people don't feel safe, if they don't feel listened to, they're not going to really speak their inner truth and open their heart and things. They're going to act in a defensive way. And I think there's a large section of the population who have every good reason to be afraid because their identity is being lost. You know, and I'm thinking particularly of the old blue-collar classes who, you know, in previous generations have been the people who've pulled the levers on the machines that have done the work in our society. And now they know they're being replaced by people in China who do it cheaper and soon to be replaced by robots. There's a very, very genuine concern about these people. What's going to happen to us? What's going to be our identity? Who are we going to become? And quite frankly, they haven't been well listened to over the last 15 years. And that's where you get these people, when you get the things like Brexit and the Trump phenomenon, who say, okay, we're going to take care of your interests. They're also the people who've been losing out under globalization, because globalization favors the rich and the socially mobile. And people, you know, like us, I'm living in Southwest France, you living in Umbria, you know, we're able to move, and creatives are able to do that. But this is a very small section of the population. So a lot of people feel very threatened, and they have to be listened to.
I totally agree.
In the meantime, you know, they see this new enemy, which is, frankly, in basic economics, the enemy of immigration is simply the fact that labor has now become global. Capital has been global for the last 10, 15 years or more. I mean, it's global since the British Empire, but truly global since the internet and instant banking transitions. And we've got these multinational corporations who are more powerful than governments, and you know, so globalization, despite the new reaction of Brexit and Trump to sort of encroach into national sovereignty again, is here to stay, and we ain't going to change it. And the people who are the losers are the ones with the protest vote. That's why things are like they are. I see.
They are right to say something, you know, because they are the losers, and the governments or whoever who are the winners, they don't care. there is no ethical or moral fundament in our societies which went together with the globalization. The ideas for me, as it appears, are mainly what can I get out of it? What costs? And minimum cost for me, and I spread the cost somewhere else. I was thinking yesterday with a friend talking about the nuclear energy, you know. If this can only work for quite cheap money if you don't pay the aftermath, if you don't have to take care for what you are creating for future hundreds and thousands of years of other people. This is for me the characteristics of our time, that we are sort of regressing, everybody on the ladder, regressing to an egocentrism, which says, my life ends here and afterwards, poof, I'm not interested. And I get out the maximum of what I can get out for me, and caring for others. And for me, it has a little bit also to do with, we have left the religions, which gave us a framework. Sure, it was an imposed framework, but it was a framework, and people knew how to behave in the life in a sort of moral way. At least they knew when they didn't. And today we have lost that, and that hasn't been replaced. And I see there a huge problem. And also for the leading class, as for our leaders, don't care for, as we were talking about, for certain groups of people, maybe even the majority of people in their countries, they don't really care, because they have an idea, want to do something, and they do because they can. So how do we handle that?
Well, there's really a lot there. I'll try to come to it piece by piece. I mean, see, the example you started with about the side effects of the nuclear industry, in economics, that's known as an externality. And in a way, this is in a way where I came in from psychology, because I had been studying the psychology of a certain sort of phenomenon in Britain where the elite were all sent to boarding school, and anyone who could would send their children to boarding school in Britain, because it was favored over the state education. And one of the things that you had to learn, and I went to such a school myself for some time also, and I also taught in one of those schools. And so I made a special study later in psychotherapy, because I realized that the main thing that children learned in is institutions was they learned to dissociate. They had to get rid of their feelings. They had to get rid of their missing their mommy. They had to get rid of all their softness. They had to get rid of their vulnerability. And I reasoned in my, I wrote a book about this in 2000 called The Making of Them. And then I followed it up in 2014, a book called Wounded Leaders. I said, we're mass producing wounded leaders who know how to dissociate. And the problem with that is that if they cannot really understand vulnerability, how can they understand the vulnerability of others? And it's their duty as statesmen to understand the vulnerability of others. So I said, this is a bad way to produce leaders. They're wounded leaders. And it's particularly in the British case, you can see how the British leaders cannot understand foreigners. They cannot understand belonging. They only really understand their own esprit de corps, which gives a kind of entitlement. And then I realized that there's, although you can, that you can train this kind of leader, and it's quite popular also in business, it's a kind of psychopathy. But the phenomenon of dissociation was also working at other levels, working in economics. So we've dissociated the cost of nuclear energy into this thing called externality. So one of the things we have to do with bringing psychological knowledge into politics is recognize where dissociation is occurring very quickly, and the other side of dissociation is also a kind of rather vicious projection, which is the scapegoating phenomenon we alluded to earlier. That said, I am not one of those who believes that all politicians are awful, are in it, or just want to exploit us. And particularly since I worked with John Bunzel on the simple solution, where I was basically, looking at the sort of identity issues. But one of the things I learned from John was the extent to which politicians are much less powerful than we think, because the competition, the international competitiveness keeps them actually in a very, very weak position where they can't do the things that they want to do because basically can't afford it. They can't afford to slip behind. And I've no doubt that most politicians come in driven by values, ready to change the world. And I think actually they're much more impotent than we think. And what I have noticed amongst sort of people in my own consciousness group more and more is that we also do a bit of this dissociation, projection, and blame stuff, where we kind of say, now listen, we're the good guys, we belong to Friends of the Earth, we vote for the Green Party and stuff. Our identity is good. We, in a way, are good ones, and it's the corporations and politicians who are bad, and they should sort this thing out. And, I realize it's really, really very much like, it's kind of like the child in us, it's saying, we're the good children, you're the bad parents, you got to fix this. And working with John, it was very interesting because John was constantly saying, listen, it belongs to all of us. We're all in the same boat. We have to find a way to use our political power, our votes better, and expressing ourselves for policies rather than parties, because parties we're all seeing is like, it's finished. It's no going nowhere, party politics now. You have to be able to vote, realize that our politicians are not all corrupt. I mean, there are some, of course, and there are dictators. They're mostly impotent. Our corporations are all just too big, so we haven't got national sovereignty. Globalization isn't going away. And so we have to somehow, use our vote better. And within that, we have to speak and listen. We have to listen to the disaffected people who are voting for these idiots like Trump, because they're protesting, and we have to hear their protests and let them feel safe.
So what I'm hearing you say is that it's sort of up to us who believe we are a little bit more developed to give up our superiority in thinking we are better than everybody else, and we can blame who we want to blame. And why we are doing this, we are playing the same game which we are accusing others to do, no? And that we need to find a different solution. And there it comes back what I said before, take responsibility for what is happening in the state. And I think the solution, which is the simple solution from John Bunzel, is a perfect way to do that. It's such a shame that so few people know about it. And maybe it's easier to talk about than to do it. So
yeah, sure, of course. The Bunzel's thing is an experiment that's in the right direction, and it's actually very pragmatic. But there are also other things. For example, I don't know if you remember, beginning of last year, when we had all these elections in Europe, and the one that was the most important, really, it seems to me, was the Dutch election, because they had very, very strong right wing, very articulate, much more articulate than Marine Le Pen, for example. And that was early in the year, and there was a feeling that if Holland goes to the far right, then France and Germany would follow. Now, I'm not claiming that this is what did it, but some colleagues of mine, also in the psychotherapy world, they began an initiative of going out and speaking to those who were voting for the Populist Party and listening to them and creating a dialogue. And a lot of people got involved in this. Now, luckily, they didn't win the election, but actually there was this movement in a new went on, and I'm not saying it actually it was a causal thing, but certainly energetically it starts to shift something, because it's very easy for us to say, oh, bloody hell, these Trump voters, they're just bloody idiots, and actually mostly those are traditional people, salt of the earth people, working class people. They're like my father's people. I don't know about your background, but they are people who've believed the myth of modernism, which ran on for a couple of hundred years. Of course they did, and who the people who join the army and the fire brigade and drive the ambulances and blah 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 blah. Who actually have a code of self-sacrifice, and they need to be included in the dialogue.
Yeah, I wanted to that a moment. Isn't that also a phenomena? Holland was one of the countries which was most progressive. Isn't it normal that then the counterforce is of equal measurement? And that if we don't get them together, that there is a separation, as it is now in America, because the blame is to be on both sides and not only on one. It's not only the bad right people, there are also the bad left people, because they didn't do what is needed to do. They went overboard, and so they created a push for the others to push back. We know that from physics, the law, one push creates the other. So.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Holland is a very experimental country. They've tried everything there, and the same thing happened actually in Denmark. Denmark was one of the first countries to get a kind of rabid far right, because they just opened their doors to people from Bosnia and Kosovo and Somalia, and actually they thought that people were going to then become good Danish citizens, but they didn't. And because it's not so easy. It's not so easy to make those kind of cultural translations.
And it's the normal false ideas of people, especially green people, who green in sense of spiral dynamics, who think what we believe, our values are the best. And how come that you don't have the will? They don't even bother of teaching new people that our culture is different. They just assume that everybody would think and believe and have the same values as themselves. And then I had it in my personal life. I had some people here from Romania and gave them a lot and was completely then disappointed that they didn't, repay me in any way, even stole my stuff. And afterwards I thought, oh, I knew that theoretically, but practically I have assumed if I being generous with them, they would in some way give you some recognition for that and at least behave well, but no, it's just they don't have the same. When you give them something, they say, oh good, I have it. But the next part, which we would think, oh, how can I do something for you? You have given me this favor. Oh, you fell out. So I was saying that we would react in a way, if somebody gives us a lot of, favors or helps you, that we would think, oh, I help you back when you are in need, But this is a sort of higher level development. And we know that in lower levels, that's not. In the egocentric level, people don't feel that way because they cannot see it. They cannot just not integrate it in their worldview yet. Doesn't mean that the people are bad. It's just they don't see it. No. And we have this error that we think, as we see the world, everybody should see that. And then we are disappointed and need somebody to blame when it doesn't work.
Right. Right. So again, this is where we need some psychology, because now what you're talking about now is incredibly complex. What I hear you talking about there are different levels of values and consciousness which run through human beings at different all kinds of different levels, and these are increased by the various kind of national mindsets that are there at the same time. So the complexity is enormous, and you know, for example, I couldn't, you know, I couldn't live in Sweden where my son lives, and I couldn't live there because I've noticed there are whole kinds of things about the very deep structure of society which Sweden has, which as an Englishman, I find very difficult. You know, I come from a nation of eccentrics. In Sweden, you can't be eccentric. Everybody has to have the same values. You know, you can't talk in money. You can't talk about money in Sweden. I mean, in fact, they've got rid of money. Did you know that? You can't use money in the shops. You know, so I think, you know, if I was a Syrian trying to integrate in Sweden, I'd find it bloody difficult too. And so, all these levels of complexity, and including the fact you take people, you know, from the people coming from one part of the world into another, and this is going to happen. This isn't going to stop. You know, what we've got going on at the moment, I see, is what the great historian Arnold Toynbee called a Völkerwanderung. You know, it's like what happened in the Dark Ages. Everything's moving and mostly attracting from the global south to the global north. Yeah, and we're not going to stop it by changing the color of our passports. I'm sorry to say, Great Britain, it's not going to happen. We're going to have to accommodate it, and within that, we've got people coming in a way from where sort of rather medieval customs are still in existence to where there are postmodern customs. But it's also going on in our own societies. One of the things I see in the UK and in America is that the same, back to those same kind of blue collar workers, they are obviously frightened by their communities changing color and everything like that. They hang on to an idea that their jobs are being taken, which isn't true. Their jobs are disappearing because of global factors long before the immigration happened, actually. But they hang on to that. But they are also, what you hear repeatedly, they're fed up with what they call elitism. And a better word for elitism, I say, is the phenomenon of postmodernism, which is where we take egalitarianism and the recognition of power structures in society for granted, and where there are all kinds of very difficult things to digest, such as the way that gender has become a political issue, for example. Uh-oh. I think, hello, I think the thought police have got us. I can see me and only a static picture of Heidi. Yeah.
There was noise outside, so I had to close the door. So I hope we can go on.
Yeah, you see, there are certain issues which have actually, you know, to increase the complexity, which are actually psychological ones that have become political and they shouldn't have done. And gender is one of them. And the notion that we've got this notion now that we can choose a sexual identity. Where is Heidi Hornlein? Wo ist sie?
Yeah, I'm here. You could have continued. I heard you, but I had to give some instructions to avoid the noise. Okay, let's continue.
Yeah, okay. You see, some of these, in the postmodern world, one of the things that we've done is we've put ideas above everything. So for example, in the gender field, an idea that you can be any gender you want, you can have a relationship wherever you want, and it goes beyond, this is over and above the body, has become the dominant mindset at the moment. And of course, it's fueled by the sort of things like Me Too, which says actually masculinity is very toxic. And, it's again the identity issue. We are the good but victimized group, and these powerful men are the bad predatory group. So we've got all this kind of stuff going on, which is becoming political issues. And behind that, something terribly important, that actually we need to have a society which is tolerant of all kinds of desires. If you want to live with a woman or a man, I mean, surely that's up to you, and not to be pathologized. But we've gone so far, we start to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So we've gone to say, well, your body doesn't matter. What matters is your choice. And actually, what I see, this is horribly consumeristic, in fact. It's like your sexuality is like another choice. You can be whoever you want. And you can get some doctor to cut up your body for you to make it the kind of body you want, just as the women are doing boobs and bum jobs, you can change your gender. It's like we're putting our technology over, beyond the body. Now, this is direction that's probably going to increase, but the sort of blue collar worker people find this kind of thing too much.
Yeah,
and we haven't listened enough about it. And they blame the elites, you see?
Yeah, it is actually too much, because in many ways, not only throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I find it quite regressive, in the sense that we were always complaining about the church and has denigrated the body because, and life itself, and the next life is the fantasy in heaven and something like this. But they do the same thing, only that they play then God themselves, because they think they can create out of technical knowledge, can create a different body and a different person. And this is so on the surface, that is so stupid for me. It really has no idea about what life is, and is actually counterproductive, because it's like going back to a belief system which has no foundation. Like the church said that the earth is flat and it's not round, and now they say the same thing, only with different words and with some different object, but they put the belief before the facts. And this for me is a big regression and nothing progressive at all. Middle wrong.
I can hear you. I can hear you're getting quite steamed up about this.
I really get so angry about people denying the fact, for instance, that women and men are different. Think about that. If they are not different, if they are the same, what comes out of it? Because now, for instance, in the Olympics, there is a difference for women doing things and men doing things. If we are the same, all the same, so we do the same sport together, and then afterwards, oh, how wonder, all men win and the women don't win. We are the victims. Excuse me, this is so short-sighted, so short thought, these ideas which are proclaimed as, as truth even. I can just go out of myself by about such a stupidity. It's stupid, nothing else. It doesn't mean that there can be people being gay or whatever. That's not the problem. The problem is that you think that you can choose these things, like gender, like your body. You cannot choose your body. You can transform your body in a certain way, because or you eat more or you eat less and things like that. You eat healthier and less healthier. Yes, you have a certain influence on your body, but you are not omnipotent and can change the whole system, which you are as a person.
But
End of the rant.
Listen, I agree with you, but I don't think when you said it's without foundation, and no, it has got a foundation, and there's two foundations, and one is a Platonic one, which did affect the church, which divided the body and soul, or the body and mind. Yeah, and that has had a huge influence of us over centuries and centuries and centuries. So much so that, I mean, you know, what's happening at the moment in my country? Well, the Pope is just visiting Ireland. Yeah, so you get this ability to engage in sexual abuse with the body of a young child, because it's not the body that's important, it's just the mind or the spirit or the soul that's important. And so it leads to a very disconnected way of being in the world. And I think that's what we're saying. And what I also see is the same philosophy got overexcited again in the European Enlightenment, where it was seen that the earth was like dead matter, like, you know, it's like a body, but it's not really the thing. And the rational man was really the thing. And that permitted us to exploit the earth without any conscience. And the natives somehow were like to do with the earth, and they were kind of savage, raw material, not the white European colonial males, of course. So this whole thing does have a foundation. And then out of that modernism, we get this modern capitalism and this excessive consumerism. So we think my choice to send my child to private education, my choice to buy a Mac or a PC, my choice to have my body the way I want it, or my child's body the way I want it, is more important than the body. Now, you see, this is where perhaps those of us like you and I have perhaps been through like things like body psychotherapy, and, you know, and we realize the body is the foundation. And actually, as a good choice comes about by aligning with the body, not jumping out of it.
Exactly, and that's why I say that these movements are a regression instead of progressive, because they call themselves progressive, but they are going back on the tradition, which is not a good one, which you are named now.
Well, they are also regressive for another reason, which people don't often think about, which is again a bit complex, because it has to do with developmental psychology. I mean, you'll hear a lot of people saying that, oh, by the age of 4 or 5, I knew I should have been a girl, or I knew I wanted to sleep with you know. And actually, mostly the kind of deep thoughts about sexual partnership don't really arise in the body until puberty, which happens anywhere between sort of 10 and 14. So, and what is happening at about 4 or 5 and 6 is what developmental psychologists call the Oedipal period, where they're children, we're looking at mummy and daddy and saying, oh, we like mummy and we like daddy. How do mummy and daddy relate to each other? And if we don't like what we see, for example, we'll try to come up with a solution. And that's quite normal. And then you have the other phenomenon is that adults hear these children or see these troubled children, and they project their own sexual consciousness into that. And what the consciousness they project is that everybody should be free to be allowed to have the sexuality they want, the gender they want. And it bypasses the whole developmental psychology thing. So they say even a child of 5 should have that. And this is total nonsense. So we at the same time, our kids are growing up and going on the street without any kind of sexual guidance at all about what it's like being born into a woman's body or into a boy's body, you know, and what that means. And so we're really letting our kids down, because here's the point from before, this sexuality gender thing has become political. It's entered the social political discourse, and it should have done it. This should belong to sociology and psychology, and you know, it belongs to. In the only way it's political is that how do we grow societies that are tolerant? and don't pathologize like, say, the Russians do around homosexuality.
Yeah.
But we've gone too far. We've gone too far, and that is noted by the blue collar classes, and they blame the elites for that, and they blame experts, and they blame the academics, and they're not entirely wrong in this, you see.
Not at all.
And so they voted with their feet. So in a way, that's why I say we have to develop what the Swedish philosopher Hansi Freinacht calls a listening society. We've got to really listen to people more and more and more, and say, what are their concerns, what are their values, and what are the policies you'd want to vote on, and give more time for this, so that then people, if they're listened to, they don't act out. If they're listened to, they don't vote in really nasty guys like Trump.
And to be able to do that, when we talk about integral theory, you must be already quite well developed in second tier, because when you're in the first 6 levels of development, you still think what you believe is the only right thing, and what the others think and believe, and their values are all. And so we need personally a big amount of people need to grow out of first tier into second tier to be able to create an understanding and to make people who are not there feel listened to. Because, if you are a modernist person and you listen to another person, give them an ear, as you say, I think, then you listen in a way to find out what can I sell them next, Or when you listen from a green perspective, you listen in this ideology, what suppression is there? What can I free this person from? What suppression? And there I wanted also to go back to this, what you said before. But first, finishing this, as long as you are in this trap of needing to be right all the time, and you have the truth and all the others are boo, then you have a problem. And you cannot resolve the problem. And when you do the jump into second tier, you can see all the good parts of the previous stages and use them. And one of that is, for instance, the education into adaptation. You need the conventional state. So as the child development, we know that children first need to have a set of rules to orient themselves. And this implies to be, when I have a masculine body or feminine body, that I'm a boy and a girl, with many other things. You cannot ask your child with 4 years, do you want to go in holidays to Australia or in, to Norway? That's just things which the children cannot yet decide. Like gender, they cannot yet decide it because they have no framework in which to create decisions. So we know that it needs a certain level of child development, and I think nobody will doubt that at least children have levels of development, and because normally before they run 100 meters in 5 seconds, they first have to learn to walk. These things seem to be accepted. I hope so, even from those people who are saying that the gender you can choose. So you first need to have a framework in which you can be safe yourself and you know who you are. And then you can slowly widen the boundaries. Instead, what we are doing now is closing the boundaries, and much too early. You tell people they have to be like this for the whole life. And even I hear that they do even operations already with children. For me, it's mutilation. This is a crime. Which is a crime like what you say with the Pope now in Ireland. It is abuse of children. Only that their own parents do it, that's even worse. So that's what I think about this. So we need to have a framework first, which afterwards we can transcend and get our freedom later, when we are old enough and mature enough to have an overview and to really go deeply into the question instead of following a trend or a political slogan or something like that.
Yeah. And you were talking, just for the benefit of anyone who didn't recognize it, you were using some Gravesian language about first and second tier, and sort of it became spiral dynamics, and you used the word green. And so the green, or the postmodern position, is in consciousness just before the big leap into second tier, and has rightfully been, I think, identified by Ken Wilber as being problematic, in that at this point, people believe they really are at the end point of civilization and growth and development, and everyone else is pretty stupid or bad. And that gives a very satisfying identity feeling. And sometimes the kind of things you were talking about, I've also seen that, say, you've got these lovely hippie parents who want everyone to be free, and they don't put any boundaries around their children. The children get absolutely wild, and they're not safe. Actually, children are not safe because boundaries are all to serve safety, and they make them choose things far too early, and that sort of avoids them having to take the responsible positions of being accountable parents. And you don't want to do that because we're all identified in green as the good children, the mystical children against the bad parents, you see, who've been running society right up until this moment. So it really is quite a big leap out of that, and because it's very seductive, that position.
It's an irony. It's an irony. The thing is, I think, it's an irony in itself, because they become the bad parents by fighting against the bad parents. They become them themselves because they don't take their role.
I mean, this is something I started to pick up when I was working in my clinical practice, and I'd get someone come in and say they spent the last 10 years in Findhorn, and I would be really surprised that such people were much less open to new possibilities than I would have thought. Say when I got somebody coming in who's been, working in an office all their lives, and I said, look, actually, it looks like this is going on in your relationship, time to perhaps make a change and adapt to this and get some new perspective, could move very fast, actually. I was very perplexed by that. So I think that there's a way that getting out of that very seductive identity trips is one of the really biggest things that we have to do. So we really have to, in terms of those, say, three important stages: the traditional, modern, postmodern, and then the sort of world-centric, or the yellow. We have to concentrate on the blue traditional and listen to them, and we have to really re-educate and encourage the green to make the leap up to being truly more inclusive, not being so afraid of hierarchies, and see, at yellow you begin to discriminate a lot more, and otherwise that whole modernist project, which, as we said before, values the rational over the earth, is going to continue exploiting, and we're never going to get hold of these huge problems that we've got, which come about through the failure of restraint in the rational project. It's just because we have to go into regulation, we have to we've got to act in a cooperative way, as Bunzel says in Simple Solution. We can't tackle the big things from a nation-centered perspective. It's just too big for us. So the task is big. I mean, there's good and bad news is that making an attitudinal shift is very it depends. You need very little resources. You don't need to create any new institutions. But of course, the psyche is very, very resistant to big attitudinal shifts. So yeah, so we have to really get this psychologically informed politics going now as soon as we can. It's just too late for the old style now.
Yeah, and I wanted to go back to the postmodern stage, which is a contradiction in itself. No, they don't realize that they are playing the game and reinforcing the game, which they actually started to fight against. And this is so tragic.
Yeah.
It's so tragic that they don't see these contradictions and still believe that they are the only thing what they say is right. And so.
No, you're right.
The complete confusion.
They're very connected. Yeah, modernism and postmodernism, two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, and then the fact is that as parents are grown, as you say, in this idea of freedom, personal freedom, and so on, which is right, but went too far. What they did, what Ken Wilber says, that the development had on the turning points went wrong, because they only went up the ladder, let's say, but forgot to include. So what we see with modernists, and especially with postmodernists, they don't include the rules, the rule structure of the conventional state, where we said before, you need the boundaries to have a safe space, and from there you go out, no? Like little children, when you protect them, then they can go out. When the mama is nearby, then they can go out and explore the world. And if we don't have that, we are in continuous research of something which gives us hold. And so we get susceptible for demagogues, for demagogic ideas, for totalitarian ideas and all the things, because there's somebody who promises us to give us what we need. And if they do or not, they are not interested in this. The promise is enough. And then afterwards, no, what happened to us? And the victimism is the consequence. And this is just not a progress, So for me, I don't know if you know Jordan Peterson. I like him for the fact that he is healing this gap of the traditional, the missing traditional layer in human development of this modern times, because we need that. And then coming back to parents, they have a big confusion about their own identity, personal identity, and the role as parents. They think when the role asks them to say no to children, then they are bad. And this creates this incapacity. They don't want to be bad, and so they don't say no to their children. But they don't get it, that the role as a parent is completely different than your own being. That's not you. It's you are playing so many roles in your life, and one is parent. And when you want to be a good parent, you have to do certain things. It's part of your role. As if you are in a workplace, you have to do certain things. And if you think that's you personally, then you have a problem. And that's what I think is the root of the problem with postmodern education, that they confuse the role self with the real self.
Yeah. And I think, just not to, become too technical, but you talked about that process that Ken Wilber identified, the transcending and including in these sort of contextual levels of consciousness, where there are also there are values at all these different levels which are important at those levels. I think what happens in what I notice in the further ends of development there is that the process starts to become more include and transcend rather than transcend and include. So that actually That's when I'm saying, oh, we really got to listen to people. We really got to listen to these blue collar workers, you know, and these sort of things. We've got to bring them with us. We've got to bring them with us. You know, it's not make them the same, but bring them with us, because I value that quality in me and in them, and I've got something to learn from them also. You know, these are guys that get up at 6 a.m. and do the job. When I just want to be, you know, I want to get up a lot later and check my emails. You know, there's all kinds of ways we can actually become really inclusive. Well, because we have to. We've got no option now if we're going to make this world work.
Yeah, and not only inclusive, really inclusive, also appreciative. We need to appreciate. Yeah, for instance, if you buy an apple or whatever, you know, do you think ever how many people have contributed to have this machine in front of you, or the cell phone, or whatever you buy? Whoever thinks about how many people have worked on it that you finally can have it in your home? We just find it normal. We go in a shop and buy it. But there are sometimes thousands of people, and they have sacrificed. They got up at 6 a.m, as you say, and we don't want to get up at 6 a.m. You know, it's normal. We don't have to, because blah, 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 you know. But there are really people who are doing the work, and we never appreciate that enough. And these are the ones who feel left out, and then we complain even, oh, they're stupid. Yeah. So I think we have to rethink a lot of our attitudes towards the world, towards other people, whoever it is, towards the migration situation, which could be a little bit handled different, but, you know, as long as humans decide with their own ideological ideas, things go one way or the other. No, now in Italy we had the situation, which was quite heavy, of the people who were left on the ship, and couldn't go down for 6 days or something. Anyway, that's part of the mindset of these people, no? I mean, of the who is governing, and this is their right to express themselves as they are. But we need to vote for other people's and other people in politics, and there we come back to the loop, you know, where you started out.
Yeah, that's right. And we also come back to the fact that actually it's happening so fast. It's happening so fast at the moment, these changes, that we're all overwhelmed. So, you know, look what happened to Merkel. Firstly, really all that tremendous open-heartedness towards the immigrants that she instigated, and then the incredible backlash about 18 months later. It's you know, the speed of this thing, it's beyond us at the moment to reckon with, the way things are going. So we have to be also compassionate for ourselves a bit, I think. Yeah, there we go.
Here we go. That was a very, very interesting discussion. I'm not sure if we fully completed it. I don't think so. There will be much more to say, and hopefully we find another moment and a regular show, live show, so people can participate and ask questions. And I thank you very much for the moment, and see you another time.